Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. In today's video, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at China and their population crisis. As we all know, China has a very large population, almost about 1.5 billion people, and they largely supply the world with many cheap gadgets like phones, electric vehicle batteries, and very cheap mining tactics, at least relative to what the Western nations can supply. Now, looking at China here, we've got a little bit of an introduction, but China was once the world's most populous nation, now being surpassed by India, and a driving force in global manufacturing. It's facing an unprecedented demographic crisis. Birth rates have plummeted to historic lows, creating a population decline that could have staggering economic, social, and geopolitical consequences. Now, this report here, we're really going to be looking at the birth rate problem in China. As we all know, right, an economy at its foundation, at its core, is only as strong as its population is and their will to work in that economy. So, looking at China over the last few decades, they've had an epic rise to power and have increased their GDP substantially as they've been able to export their raw materials and products across the seas to other nations, especially countries like the United States, which can pay a premium. So if we look at the birth rates of China, right, going back to the year 1990, they had a rather stable birth rate, which was above the 2.1 birth rate needed to keep the population where it is. However, in the most recent decades, right, from early 2000s up to recently, the birth rate has gone from about 1.8 to a replacement value of 1, which, as we can see here, that looks terrible, and it is. Since a replacement value needed to maintain the population, right, is 2.1 births per woman, if we're at a replacement value of 1 birth per woman, in China, that means that the population is set to decline extremely rapidly over the coming decades. So, what does this mean for China? Well, first, it's very bad when it comes to their GDP, their economics, and their strength when looking at the country as an export nation, right? China's only been able to be a strong exporting nation to the rest of the world, right? They have very large trade surpluses with surrounding countries and Western countries like the United States because they've been able to take advantage of their healthy, large population for so many decades. However, it appears that they have now some pretty negative consequences going on from all that explosive growth over those last few decades, resulting in a much lower population or fertility rate for births per woman. So going forward, what does this mean for China, and how do they have to change in how they operate, and how will it affect us? And essentially, this means that China's going to have to downsize their economic global superpower, at least their goals long term, in terms of their strength worldwide. If their population is set to decline by 50% or more, and it's essentially guaranteed, looking at their current birth rates, something's going to have to change in terms of them being a massive export nation to possibly being having trade deficits in the coming decades over time. Now, of course, I don't think anything in the short term will happen in China, negatively speaking, for their GDP. I think they've got a good handful number of years left until some really bad stuff hits the fan, right? But if China's fertility rate is set to decline so much and their workforce specifically falls as a result, this means that Western nations and Western modernized nations, which are used to large amounts of consumption of cheap goods, raw materials, and such, if we lose that, that's going to have an impact on our economies as well. So if we understand this ahead of time, we can sort of plan for it, whether it be from an economic investment standpoint or whatnot. You can make up your own mind when it comes to that. But what this means is that we are, as a nation, right, America or other nations, maybe it's like Vietnam or India, that will have to start leveraging their younger, more youthful populations to help make up the difference that China's going to be going through here. But looking at China's debt, right? China has massive amounts of debt. I think it's around $20 trillion USD, right? High interest rates, right? China's in conjunction with high amounts of debt and an extremely devastating decline in birth rates, things are not looking very good. Additionally, if we look at some other metrics here going forward, I think these are some conservative numbers, but looking at their current labor force, right? In 2010, it actually appears it looks like it peaked, close to about 1 billion peoples in the workforce, contributing to the Chinese economic boom and power that they were able to take hold in those years. But going forward to the year 2050, that number seems to be declining closer to around 600 million. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if that number goes even lower. And if their birth rate maintains around 1 births per woman, even if it improves slightly, that number is going to get drastically worse beyond the year 2050. So if that's the case, I mean, that means nations like even the United States may sometime in the next 100 or 200 years surpass China in terms of population size overall, which here looking at this really means, and it almost guarantees China will never surpass the United States in terms of becoming a global superpower simply based off of the demographics. And so much of China's wealth and their assets, right, like the Chinese household assets, is tied up in real estate. If their fertility rate is so low and there's fewer buyers on the market to buy homes, apartments, etc. in the future, that's going to put a lot of negative pressure on those asset savings of the older Chinese, which really rely on that for their future retirement. So you have like this multi-trifecta effect happening in China that is going to be extremely devastating, as we have never had a precedent for such a fast birth rate decline in such a short period of time. When China implemented the one-child policy, when they were having too many kids, it really skewed the demographics of China in an unnatural, unhealthy manner that is now having negative effects. And even since China removed the one-child policy some years ago, it hasn't had any major effects in any positive way to increase the birth rate from 1 child per woman, which is what we're seeing today. You extrapolate this long term, nothing looks too good. But on the bright side here, if you see this as, yes, it is a problem, but it can also be an opportunity with the correct perspective. If China's going to be losing their economic prowess, right, their ability to produce at such a high level, it means someone else is going to have to make up for it. So today, what we can do, if you're watching it correctly, you can invest in that upcoming problem to try to solve it yourself and be the beneficiary. As bad as that might sound, someone's going to have to do it. Since China's such a large amount of the products that we buy, right? Every time I go on Amazon or look around at the products in my house or other people's houses, buildings, etc., so much of it is Chinese-made product. And looking at the demographics, it is guaranteed that our source of those products will have to change locations of where that is being made and manufactured, since there's going to be fewer people living in being alive in China and actually working to make those future products we're going to be needing. So where do we shift our attention to actually solve that problem and build out that new supply chain? In China, I mean, if you look at the mining strategies that they have and the regulation, there's very little. They can just mine pretty much wherever and whenever they want, and the government allows it, as the government sees that the more of the supply chain that they own, the more power they have over other nations. And we've really seen their government invest in that exact manner over the last few decades. But all that seems like it's guaranteed to go away, whether or not China likes it. So what is the domino effect, right? So it's going to be supply chain disruptions, right? So China's going to be making fewer things. Maybe things move to India and Vietnam or Mexico to make up for it, right? Luckily, the United States is in a pretty good position, right, geographically speaking, to actually make those changes. Mexico is our neighbor. They have a rather healthy demographic, especially relative to China, and a strong workforce that can help supply us with those needed changes when it comes to Americans' unlimited needs and wants when it comes to those products and services for whatever that might be. Looking here, right, China's property market is 70% of household wealth, but declining population means fewer home buyers. It's all about supply and demand. If there's no young people to buy those homes, the old people have no one to sell it to, which means that their investment savings get wiped out. China's entire economy, their investments, right? It's all structured differently in China. The vast majority of folks in China don't own assets like like stock market assets, right? Like Americans do, where we own a bunch of companies, right? Public or private, to make up the bulk of our retirement savings. Whereas in China, it's all mostly tied to just owning homes, right? The property, which if the population is going to decline by 50% every, let's say, 50 years, that is extremely unsustainable and is guaranteed a negative slope going forward. Also, rising geopolitical tensions. A weaker economy may push China to become more aggressive internationally, which is something we can arguably see in the South China Sea as they try to expand and build up their defenses longer term. Even economic struggles to destabilize internal politics and such. A global reliance on China for manufacturing means economic crises in China will ripple worldwide. If we look at this all here, I mean, going out to the year, I would say in the next 5 or 10 years, we'll see very minimal effects. But by the year 2040, 2050, things get incredibly bad for China. So again, this represents some pretty bad destruction in China, but simply it'll be a drastic and major supply chain shift from China to other nations that can absorb the problem. Unlike America, which America has a whole bunch of immigration and such to counteract possibly a bad birth rate that we have in America of about 1.6 children per woman, China does not have the immigration benefit that America has. There's simply not enough people in the world who want to or can migrate to China. It's just not going to happen, and it can't happen. And no matter how hard China's government seems to be working to increase that birth rate and try to turn the tide in their favor, it doesn't seem to be working. When they're sitting at a fertility rate of one birth per woman in China, that is the key problem at the end of the day, and a drastic one. I mean, looking forward in the future, China is pretty much guaranteed to be not a wasteland, but pretty close to it, as there just won't be enough people to maintain the current infrastructure and such that they've currently built out, and they'll probably turn to a net importer, right? As their population ages, right? And they have such a large population with fewer young people being born, this is going to put massive strain on the young people in China, as there will be so many more older people in China rather than young people. It's simply guaranteed looking at these numbers, right? So as the older people in China retire out, they put more strain on the younger people. Those older folks are going to be putting a very large strain on the workforce of the younger Chinese people, which means that those younger Chinese people can't export all those extra items because all the older Chinese people will be absorbing that excess, any of that excess supply of goods and services, which essentially guarantees the economic downfall of China longer term. I'm not sure how they can turn this around. The only way I can see China really curbing this problem here is by heavily investing in artificial intelligence and robotics as they have been, which I still don't think is enough. China needs to, the only way China could curb this problem is if they became the absolute best in the world by a long shot in AI and robotics to counteract this problem and replace their dying workforce with that AI and robotics. It's the only other strategy that could possibly make sense and make up for the difference in the smaller workforce, which I don't think is going to happen, as there's also going to be a lot of that exact same AI and robotics competition overseas in nations like the United States, which if nations like the United States, which currently do have a lead in AI and robotics, leverage that exact first place leader stance in our benefit, it puts even further strain on China, as we may be able to accelerate our increased production output and lower our costs using AI and robotics as well, putting less of a competitive edge on China, which they currently have, but doesn't seem like they will maintain for very long. So it seems like in the short term, China, meaning like China in the next 5 or 10 years, they can still leverage their industrial base, but it does not seem like it'll be a permanent strategy for sure, as it's essentially guaranteed to change. I mean, looking at the world from a global perspective, the power lies in the numbers of workers in that nation, right? Any nation with a young, healthy workforce is going to outcompete and outgrow a nation with a smaller or shrinking workforce with an unhealthy demographic and birth rate. That's really how things work at the end of the day. Gross domestic product, right, is people buying things, selling things, and so on. If there's fewer people doing that exact same transaction of buying and selling, the economy shrinks, the tax base gets smaller, the government gets weaker, and things get worse. So that's really what you're trying to not happen in any government or any nation at the end of the day. So I think that's why leaders like Elon Musk, other people are saying that the population crisis, right, the birth rate crisis, is the largest and most detrimental crisis going on under our noses as we speak. It's just that it's going to take us a good handful of years to really play out and for us to see all the problems that matures out of the current birth rate happening today. And it'll be quite fascinating and probably pretty sad to see at the same time, as again, all these numbers are guaranteed, right? If there's like in the year 2023, we know there was 9 million births that took place, right? In 1990, there was almost 24 million births taking place. We know exactly how many 35-year-olds exist in China. It's probably close to this 23 million number. In 20 years, right, or in 25 years, these 9 million people will be entering the workforce, right? They'll be about 25 years old, great age to enter the workforce. But it's a much smaller number than what was happening in 1990 at their peak birth rate. And that's really the problem right there. So it appears over the next 50, 100 or so years, China's population size will be going from, I think, about 1.4 billion people today, probably well under 6 or 500 million people over the very long term. And it appears that they've already reached their peak and there is just no going back. But I really hope that this video, guys, gave you a good perspective on what to look for in the future, and maybe just kind of got your mind moving and thinking about future opportunities as well, maybe just in terms of where to place your money investing and things like that, and what to expect in terms of supply and demand going in the future. But thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will see you guys on the next video.